come to order. This morning we are here to discuss the federal response to escalating wildfires. As it so happens, wildfire smoke from the wildfires burning right now in Canada has been affecting the skies, as you can see outside, and if you've been outside, you can sure taste it. Some of my colleagues on the committee, particularly those from the western states, have much more firsthand experience with the impact of wildfires than some of us. Those impacts are numerous and range from devastating loss of life and property to air pollution. For example, the Government Accountability Office recently reported that smoke from U.S. wildfires now makes up 30% of the United States emission of particulates. And things aren't improving. In fact, in the last 2 decades, the top 4 largest wildfires in human history have occurred in both the northern and southern hemisphere. In the U.S., more than half of the most destructive wildfires in our history have occurred since 2018. Also, the acres burned annually have doubled in the past 30 years and are forecast to double again in the next 30 years. Our committee has discussed at length the impacts of climate conditions and past mismanagement of forest that has ushered in a new era of fuels and wildfires. We've essentially created a perfect storm, and as a result have witnessed an increase in the occurrence of megafires, with communities across the West suffering from tragic loss of life and property. While agency leaders have talked about correcting this course for some time, it unfortunately seems that with each passing year we continue to slip further behind, because most of our committee members are now intimately familiar with the causes and impacts of wildfires. We're going to spend much of our time this morning focusing on the firefighter workforce. As we are at the beginning of fire season for a large part of the U.S., let me first take a moment to thank all of the federal wildland firefighters for their service. These men and women bravely serve our country day in and day out, working long, grueling hours in a dangerous job. Despite the risk, they choose to continue to serve, and we all owe them a debt of gratitude and our support. My staff and Ranking Member Barrasso's staff have been talking directly with wildland firefighters and their family members, as well as several firefighter organizations, to ensure that we fully understand what federal and wildland firefighters are experiencing and how we can improve the federal capacity. We are particularly grateful to the grassroots wildland firefighters and the National Federation of Federal Employees for working with us to ensure that we understand the issues permeating the workforce as well as the pros and cons of potential solutions. Over the last 2 years, Congress has provided record levels of funding, over $10 billion, to help the federal agencies achieve a paradigm shift in the way they manage the wildland firefighting workforce and our public lands. So I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today about the bottlenecks the agencies are facing, because we must get to work changing the status quo. Not only is the safety of our communities and health of our forest and the safety of our communities at stake, but also the lives of the men and women who serve in our fire service. There are several proposals existing today that offer some creative, common sense solutions for addressing the problems facing our firefighting workforce. For example, last year, Ranking Member Barrasso and I introduced the Promoting Effective Forest Management Act, which directs the agencies to undertake a range of activities aimed at reducing fire risk on federal lands. The bill also significantly modifies a current federal policy related to retirement benefits for firefighters. In previous hearings, we've discussed how, if a federal firefighter has longer than a 3-day break in service over a 20-year career, he, or more often she, unconscionably must forfeit previously made retirement contributions. This is a policy that is impacting our workforce, and we must fix it. Also, I want to acknowledge that the administration submitted a legislative proposal with its fiscal year 2024 budget request, which will reform the way federal firefighters are paid. While this is a complicated issue, it is clear a great deal of thought and effort went into this proposal. I greatly appreciate that, and we believe we need to work to ensure that we get whatever the solution is going to be right. I am sure we will discuss both of these in more detail this morning as our committee looks at ways to increase retention in our shrinking wildland firefighting workforce. I want to thank our witnesses for being here today, and I look forward to hearing your perspectives on the situation that we find ourselves in with wildfires and our firefighters, as well as your perspectives on the potential solutions that we need. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Ranking Member Barrasso for his opening statement.
Well, thanks so much, Mr. Chairman. Thanks so much for holding this hearing today. Wildfires in Canada have ushered in smoke and poor air quality right here in Washington, D.C. this morning. This is what we have been experiencing far too frequently in Wyoming and throughout the West. And it is a sobering reminder that we must manage our forests to make them more resilient to catastrophic fires. In recent years, our western states have endured wildfires of unprecedented scale and destructiveness. These fires ravaged forests, destroyed communities, and upended lives and livelihoods. On average, roughly 8 million acres burned each year between 2017 and 2022. Now, that's more than double the average annual acreage burned in the 1990s. Western states are again bracing for what will likely be another devastating wildfire season this summer. As fire seasons have become longer and more destructive, fire suppression costs have increased dramatically. Over the last 5 years, suppression costs average $2.86 billion a year. In 2021, agencies spent a record over $4 billion in suppression activities. It is unsustainable to keep throwing more and more money and resources at suppression without dramatically increasing mitigation. Waiting for our forests and communities to burn is not a defensible strategy. America's wildfire crisis will continue to escalate until our forests are properly managed. Our forests are overgrown and they are unhealthy. This is due to decades of misguided policies, including a hands-off approach to management and associated declines in sawmill infrastructure. Between Forest Service and Department of Interior lands, over 100 million acres are at elevated risk to high-intensity, catastrophic fires. Mr. Chairman, that is more than 6 times the size of West Virginia. Fires on federal lands are typically much larger and much more destructive than fires that ignite on state or private lands. In a report from last summer, the Congressional Budget Office concluded that fires on federal lands are 5 times larger than those on non-federal lands. And that's why in this committee we have heard time and time again that federal agencies need to increase the pace and scale of fire mitigation. These increases cannot be incremental. Mitigation needs to increase by orders of magnitude. This includes the removal of hazardous fuels through mechanical thinning and prescribed burn projects. We've heard from both the Forest Service and the Department of Interior that a paradigm shift is needed. Congress has given agencies billions of dollars in additional taxpayer funding. And we have heard ambitious rhetoric. We have seen lines drawn on maps. What we have yet to see is progress at the pace necessary to actually address the problem. We know that too often such progress is stopped by regulatory red tape, by harmful litigation that prevent critical fire mitigation projects from moving forward. This committee has considered legislative solutions to cut red tape and stop frivolous lawsuits. They include Senator Daines' bill to undo the disastrous Cottonwood decision, which has tied up important fire prevention in the courts. Senator Risch's Fire Sheds Act, which would enhance collaboration and cut regulatory red tape in high-risk, fire-prone areas. And, Mr. Chairman, the bill you mentioned earlier, the bill that you and I have together, the Promoting Effective Forest Management Act, which would increase agency transparency and require the use of streamlined authorities. And I'm hopeful that in this Congress, we can actually act on these badly needed reforms. One of the major consequences of the wildfire crisis is the effect it has had on brave firefighters. A recent Government Accountability Office report concludes that increased wildfire activity across the West is straining the federal wildland firefighting workforce. Factors such as low pay, poor work-life balance, the mental and physical health challenges from fighting longer and more brutal fire seasons all are hurting the firefighting workforce. For years, our firefighters have been asked to do too much for too little in return. The only way to ensure that we have enough firefighters to defend our forests into the future is to ensure that they are fully supported and compensated. These are the issues we need to address. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I look forward to today's hearing and testimony.
Thank you, Senator Barrasso. We have a great panel assembled this morning. Today we have Mr. Jeffrey Rupert from the Department of Interior's Office of Wildland Fire. We have Deputy Chief Jalith Hall Rivera from the Forest Service. We have Ms. Kelly Norris, the interim state forester of Wyoming. And we have finally Mr. Cardell Johnson from the Government Accountability Office. And Mr. Rupert, we'll start with you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, Chairman Manchin, Ranking Member Barrasso, and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you this afternoon to provide testimony on the federal response to escalating wildfires and Interior's efforts to reform land management and wildland firefighter recruitment and retention. The discussion today will convey Interior's most pressing wildland fire needs and our efforts to support compensation for wildland firefighting, our wildland firefighting workforce, as well as to reduce risk and effectively manage wildfire response now and into the future. The climate continues to play an oversized role in the extreme fire weather we're experiencing across the nation and across the continent. A drier and hotter climate results in low fuel moisture, frequently leads to extreme conditions that produces these large and intense wildfires and megafires. In June of 2023, the National Significant Wildland Fire Potential Outlook assesses fire potential throughout the country for the next 4 months. Portions of Alaska, Oregon, Washington, Nevada, Idaho, Montana, the Great Lakes, and the Northeast are predicted to have above normal significant wildland fire potential over the next 4 months. And I would just make the obvious observation, as Chairman, you and the Ranking Member open, the smoke that and the impact that tens of millions of us are experiencing right now are an extension of that fire potential across eastern parts of North America and what's occurring in Canada right now, and that our friends and fellow citizens in the West have frequently experienced this in recent years. We are tackling this climate crisis and working to improve the wildfire resiliency of our nation's lands with the help of the bipartisan infrastructure law. It provides Interior with nearly $1.5 billion of funding over 5 years. This support is being used collaboratively with our partners to increase the pace and scale of fuels management treatments, to rehabilitate lands damaged by wildfires, fund wildland fire-related research, and to increase wildland firefighter pay. With this funding and annual appropriations, Interior is accomplishing risk reduction. Last year, we accomplished 1.9 million acres of priority reduction treatments, which was a 20% increase over 21. And this year, our goal is to treat 2.1 million acres. These longer, more intense fire years and the need to actively manage and reduce fuels across increasingly flammable landscapes has increased the demand and pressure on our workforce. It's widely recognized that a new model is needed to address wildland firefighter recruitment and retention and provide better pay, more career stability, better upward mobility, and much better work-life balance. With the passage of Bill in 22, we and the Forest Service implemented temporary special pay supplements for federal wildland firefighters. In Interior, over 3,800 wildland firefighters received support last year. This year, that support is going to more than 4,000 Interior wildland firefighters. To further advance these wildland firefighter pay reforms, this year's budget proposal includes an increase for Interior of $72 million to raise the base pay of DOI and tribal wildland firefighters. To implement these reforms, the administration has also proposed legislation that would establish a new special base pay rate for firefighters, create a new premium pay category, as well as propose a new annual pay cap. The budget also includes funding to hire additional Interior firefighters as well as tribal firefighters. Without the additional funding and reforms, we're facing a pay cliff as the bill funding is estimated to run out at the end of this fiscal year. That could have a devastating effect on not only our firefighter morale, but certainly our ability to recruit and retain firefighters. We're working closely with the Forest Service to provide much needed mental health support as well. We know that mental health is affecting firefighters. They're at elevated risk. And we just held a behavioral health and well-being summit in Boise that is being used to inform the development of a joint program moving forward. No single entity can solve the crisis alone. The Wildland Fire Leadership Council has recently updated the National Cohesive Wildland Fire Strategy. It reinforces the need to collaborate. And we very much appreciate Congress's willingness to support these efforts and help Interior effectively address this wildland fire crisis so that we can continue to work with our federal, tribal, state, local partners to protect communities, people, and resources. This concludes my statement, and I am happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. And now we'll have Ms. Rivera.
Great, thank you. Chairman Manchin, Ranking Member Barrasso, and members of the committee. Thank you for this opportunity to testify on the upcoming 2023 fire year, the ongoing wildfire crisis, and how we are working to improve forest health and protect communities. I've seen firsthand the destruction that wildfires have on communities, infrastructure, and our natural resources. And of course, today we can look right outside here in Washington, D.C. and see those impacts. Wildfire risk has reached crisis proportions, and wildfires are having more and more impacts each year. I want to personally thank our partners who answer or call for assistance to bolster our capabilities. We are grateful for all of our partners around the country and around the world who continue to pitch in to help our nation through each difficult year, as we are doing this year in Canada. As the size and severity of fires has grown, so too has our need for fire personnel. As we approach the busiest part of the 2023 fire year, the Forest Service aspires to hire 11,300 wildland firefighters nationwide. As of May 30th, we have hired 10,068 firefighters, or about 89% of our goal. We're cautiously optimistic we will reach our hiring goals. We know that that's still not enough. That's why the President's fiscal year 24 budget proposes funding to hire 970 additional firefighters in the Forest Service. In addition, for the 2023 fire year, the Forest Service will have up to 24 next-generation air tankers, more than 200 helicopters, and more than 900 engines available to manage wildfires. Wildland firefighters are the backbone of our ability to protect communities and vital infrastructure from wildfires. The only way that we're going to attract people to this challenging and hazardous work is to pay them fairly. Federal wages for firefighters have not kept pace with wages offered by state, local, and private entities. The workforce reforms proposed in the President's fiscal year 24 budget requests and supporting legislation will increase federal and tribal firefighters' pay, invest more in their mental and physical health and well-being, improve their housing options, and expand the number of permanent firefighters. These reforms build on the temporary pay increase provided by the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. And thanks to that legislation, more than 14,000 Forest Service firefighters received a temporary pay increase. However, the funding for that pay supplement will be spent by the end of September 2023 unless Congress intervenes to avert a pay cliff. To ensure pay continuity in the fiscal year 24 budget, we are proposing a permanent base pay increase for all firefighters. Our budget proposal includes a request for $180 million in the Forest Service in support of a special base rate salary table for firefighters and incident standby pay for all responders that are mobilized to an incident. This new pay table was calculated to increase the total annual compensation to a level commensurate with state and private sector wildland firefighters. For example, an entry-level firefighter would receive at least a 34% increase in pay under the new pay table. And unlike the temporary increase in bill, a permanent base pay increase is an investment in our firefighters' future, as an increase in basic pay leads to an increase in retirement benefits. We will need Congress to pass special legislation that authorizes this new pay table, and I look forward to working with all of you on that. We're working to make a difference and improve the lives of Forest Service firefighters. Together, we can make a difference in the quality of life for our firefighters that protect our own quality of life. In addition to paying firefighters fairly, we must support their mental and physical health. Our fiscal year 24 budget proposal calls for an increase of $10 million to enhance support for our firefighters' mental, physical health, and well-being. The budget also proposes a $50 million investment in housing. We recognize that addressing the housing crisis must happen now as it impacts our ability to recruit and retain our workforce. Together, these efforts would help address longstanding recruitment and retention challenges. These investments, totaling $569 million for the Forest Service, will help us ensure we can continue meeting evolving mission demands as both frequency and intensity of catastrophic wildfires are expected to increase. Long term, we must address work on the ground to ultimately address the wildfire crisis. Over the last 2 decades, we have witnessed what has become a new normal, bigger and more destructive wildfires that are extremely costly and challenging to suppress. The growing wildfire crisis created the need for a new land management strategy, and we are in the second year of carrying out our 10-year wildfire crisis strategy in the Forest Service. The strategy aims to increase science-based fuels treatment by up to 4 times previous levels, calling for up to 20 million acres treated in the National Forest System over the coming decade, and working with partners of 30 million additional acres treated in the next decade. The Forest Service is very grateful to Congress for providing the resources through the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and the Inflation Reduction Act to seed our initial work and put the wildfire crisis strategy in motion. In closing, I want to reiterate the agency's commitment to keeping our communities and firefighters safe as fire seasons grow longer and more severe. The dedication, bravery, and professional integrity of our firefighters and support personnel is second to none. We greatly appreciate the significant resources Congress has provided to take the initial steps to address the wildfire crisis, and we look forward to working with the committee to continue providing a world-class suppression response and reducing the severity of wildfires in our country. Thank you.
Senator Barrasso.
Well, thanks so much, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to introduce Kelly Norris, who is here from Wyoming. And Kelly, I'm so pleased you could join us today with such short notice. Kelly is currently a resident of Cheyenne, Wyoming. She's lived around the state in her work with the Forestry Division. Kelly has worked for the Wyoming State Forestry Division for more than 13 years. She has a degree in forestry from the University of Wisconsin, and in January, Governor Gordon appointed her to serve as our interim state forester for the state of Wyoming. Kelly has incredible experience working as a forester for both the state of Wyoming and, before that, the U.S. Forest Service. So she has years' worth of critical on-the-ground knowledge, is a valuable resource for the many issues that we're going to be discussing here today. Kelly, congratulations again on your appointment. Thanks so much for joining us today from Wyoming in Washington.
I bet she wishes back home.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Manchin, Ranking Member Barrasso, and members of the committee for the opportunity to testify on behalf of Wyoming State Forestry Division. My name is Kelly Norris, and I'm the interim Wyoming State Forester. The integration and cooperation of federal, state, and county cooperators has been a success for Wyoming. Our firefighter entities have adapted and evolved over decades to become a more effective and efficient alliance whose main focus is protecting life and our valuable communities, infrastructure, grasslands, and forests. Wyoming State Forestry is tasked with wildfire suppression and management on 3.5 million acres of state trust land and coordinating suppression on 29 million acres of private land. 48% of the state is federally owned. The BLM manages 18 million acres, the Forest Service manages 9 million acres, and the BIA manages 2.2 million acres, each having their respective suppression responsibilities. Wyoming State Forestry is an extremely small organization. We depend almost exclusively on local county volunteers and our federal partners for initial attack. State Forestry supports the state's initial attack response with our heliTAC, single-engine air tankers, and the inmate conservation crew. In Wyoming, we believe in the closest resources response concept. Typically, that means our county cooperators will be the first firefighters arriving to the wildfire. Other times, it might be the BLM or U.S. Forest Service firefighters who are responding first to a wildfire. Everyone coordinates to suppress wildfire, no matter the jurisdictional responsibility. A great example of interagency cooperation is our aviation program. We contract our helicopter and manage our program with 1 permanent and 4 seasonal employees. The Medicine Bow Route National Forest and Thunder Basin National Grasslands supports our heliTAC program by providing a trained employee to assist us in managing it. 2 detailers are also provided by the local national forest to help support the program. The committee is aware of the immediate issue with recruitment and retention for federal firefighters. This is also a challenge for our state and county fire districts. As veteran firefighters retire, they are not being replaced at the same rate. The need to effectively recruit within our county volunteer fire districts is a big concern that Wyoming is looking to address. We need to work together to find solutions that meet the needs of our wildland fire community. There will not be a one-size-fits-all solution, as the need will have to be addressed at all levels. I would like to transition the conversation to proactively managing for the health of Wyoming's forests. A recent study from the Nature Conservancy found that Wyoming's forests provided approximately $26 billion of economic value every year. Our forests are the headwaters to 4 of the nation's main river basins and provide more than just board feet sold. They should be managed appropriately for the values they provide, such as water supply and storage, wildlife habitat, recreation and tourism, and carbon storage. Wildfire and forest health threats know no boundaries, and there is an urgent need for active forest management. Last year's Fish Creek fire, located in the Black Hills, was stopped in a fuel break treatment area. The fuel break saved multiple homes while helping bring the fire down in intensity and gave our firefighters the opportunity to control the wildfire safely and effectively. State agencies must be a part of the solution to getting more management done on the ground with our federal forests. Wyoming State Forestry has increased its G&A program successfully and sold 11 million board feet of federal timber in our 2022 fiscal year. However, G&A can be more than assisting federal partners with timber sales. G&A can provide flexibility needed through our state contracting systems to complete a wide variety of projects for our federal partners. In conclusion, thank you for the opportunity to appear before the committee today. Wildland fire response continues to be one of the most challenging problems our agency faces. This primary mission is further complicated by the persistent challenges with recruitment and retention of our wildland firefighters. The other side to the wildfire response problem is long-term, as it relates to the health of our forests. We need to address how we continue to manage our forests by making strategic investments in them. We must continue to implement more active forest management on all ownerships. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Johnson.
Thank you. Chairman Manchin, Ranking Member Barrasso, and members of the committee, good morning. And thank you for the opportunity to provide testimony on this important topic. My statement today will provide the committee with insight and context on the barriers to hiring and retaining federal wildland firefighters. Firefighting is demanding work, and to better understand these barriers and the demands they place on the firefighters, GAO met with several organizations that represent the men and women that do this work. Our analysis of these barriers is informed by their perspectives, as well as our examination of information from the land management agencies. The barriers identified in our November 2022 report include low pay, remote or expensive duty stations, poor work-life balance, and career advancement challenges, among others. Low pay was cited as the top barrier despite federal actions to increase firefighter pay. Low pay impacts recruitment and retention because other industries, such as food service, offer equal or better pay for less dangerous work. Our analysis identified 3 concerns with some of the recent federal pay actions. The first concern being pay does not reflect the hazardous physical and mental demands of the job. Second, that pay may not be competitive with non-federal entities. And the third concern being that appropriated funds supporting recent base salary increases will likely run out this fiscal year. Related to low pay is the issue of remote or expensive duty stations. It has been reported that some firefighters are living out of their cars because they cannot afford housing. Duty stations that are more remote may not always provide easy access to basic services such as grocery stores or even broadband coverage, which helps firefighters stay connected with their families while they're away. Agency officials and stakeholder groups told us that raising pay as well as giving further consideration to incentives could mitigate this barrier. Low pay and expensive duty stations are also poor drivers of work-life balance. This is another barrier cited by nearly all of the stakeholders we met with. Poor work-life balance impacts retention because it drives firefighters to take a break from service or leave the workforce entirely. And if that happens, agencies lose valuable firefighting knowledge and experience. Some stakeholders said that federal agencies would be better positioned to recruit former firefighters back to service if they were eligible to return to the special retirement system available to firefighters who work more than 3 years in certain positions. However, eligibility for that special retirement system is governed by statute, so any changes to that eligibility would need to be made by Congress. Career advancement challenges pose another barrier to hiring and retaining firefighters. Without career advancement opportunities, firefighters may find it difficult to maximize their career earning potential. But some progress is being made in addressing this barrier. Agencies work with OPM to develop a new occupational series aimed at providing a clearer path a clearer career path, for firefighters. However, implementation of this is ongoing, and it really is too early to determine the outcomes. In conclusion, we want to recognize that land management agencies are actively addressing the barriers identified in our November 2022 report. The barriers are complex and interrelated, and they require long-term solutions that may need support from Congress. Addressing temporary pay actions before they expire, and changing retirement eligibility requirements to make it easy for firefighters to return to work without being penalized for a break in service may go a long way to support firefighters who risk their lives to protect our communities, such as from the smokes that we're experiencing today, as well as our critical infrastructure and natural resources. This concludes my oral statement, and I'm happy to respond to questions. Thank you, Chair.
Let me thank all of you for your insight and your address. I'll start my questions with Ms. Norris. I understand you previously worked for the Forest Service, and I'm curious to hear why you decided to leave the Forest Service and instead work for the great state of Wyoming State Forestry Division. And Mr. Johnson, in your testimony, you mentioned that the current retirement system might affect the agency's ability to attract former firefighters to return to the federal service. So this question is for both of you. Can you tell us more about the issues, Mr. Johnson, you were referring to, and Ms. Norris, tell us why you left?
Thank you.
And you can't have her back.
Thank you, Chairman. That's correct. I did leave the Forest Service. So that had to do with the fact that my husband and I at the time found a position at the base of the Bighorn Mountains, and that's where I wanted to be. And so I took the state forestry job. Now, I stayed with state forestry for multiple reasons. State forestry offered me a great opportunity to make a difference for the state of Wyoming. We are in the communities. We are helping do management across private, state, and federal lands. We are fully a part of every aspect when it comes to wildland fire, to planting trees in our communities, and creating orchards, to helping a landowner learn how to actively manage their timber. Outside of that, the pay is just as good as the Forest Service, and when it gets to the point, I have a great group of people I get to work with, top notch.
You're getting more satisfaction because you have more flexibility than you did with the Federal Forest Service?
Yes, and I have a great culture to work with.
Have you basically given any of your input back to the former agencies, or that some changes that need to be made? Because we've got to find a working environment that basically enriches our Forest Service employees now, as you've been enriched by the state of Wyoming.
Yes, and I agree with you, and I think it's all about the culture and of support. I have top-notch people I get to work for and work with.
Great. Mr. Johnson.
Thank you. So with the retirement system, firefighters who serve in a primary firefighting role are eligible for a special retirement system that is similar to law enforcement, where after 20 years of service, they're eligible to retire. Mm-hmm. And so after spending that 3 years, they're able to, in that primary firefighting role, they're able to move on to other roles. So for example, support or fire management role. If they take a break in service, and let's say they want to come back 7 years later, they have to start back over in the primary firefighting role, which we've all recognized is a very stressful and strenuous
That's common
work.
sense. Why hasn't that been changed?
Well,
You have the ability to change it, I'm sure.
Yes, so changes for that are governed by statute, so that would require legislative action.
Thank you. Say no more. Yeah, I think we heard you loud and clear. So your opinion is basically that we have to basically give you the direction, give you the code to do that with.
Yes, that is what
And
we've
have
heard.
you made that request to us before today?
So this is something that we have identified in our November 2022 report, and it is one of the things that I wanted to highlight in our testimony for you.
Thank you for doing so, and we will, Martin, you get right on that, okay? Mr. Rupert and Ms. Hall Rivera, I understand that prior to the bipartisan infrastructure law being enacted, recruitment and retention among federal firefighters was waning. But let's look at it as an example, an imaginary employee, and let's follow the money. In this example, a firefighter quits federal service to go to work for a state agency or private contractor. When a fire comes, I understand that when we don't have enough federal firefighters, federal appropriations are used to reimburse a state agency verbatim for the rate it pays its firefighters, or are used to pay the private contractor whatever it wishes to charge. Now, with that, does that mean the firefighter is receiving an increased pay and the federal government is paying for it, and it's better for them to work from an outside group than from within?
I'll start. Yes, Senator, that is accurate. We, of course, depend on our cooperators and our contractors. They're an important part of our system. But if we are not able to compensate our firefighters and they leave and go and work for those entities, the federal government's still going to be paying for that.
Is that a code thing? Is that our fault too?
No, it's just how the system works, right? We all cooperate together, but you know, it's an expensive endeavor for the federal government
We're going
to
pay
reimburse.
whatever, right? We're going to pay the contractor whatever.
Right, right. In a busy year, for example, take 2021, the Forest Service paid over $470 million to state cooperators.
Mr. Rupert, real quick.
I would just add 2 quick points to that. One, exactly as said, when wildfires are occurring, we must respond. So the response is going to occur. And 2, if you look at structurally how that, like say, contractor support is paid for, it's with suppression funds. And in the case where that is more expensive, that's one of the direct threats to the funding fix, which has functioned very well up to this point. And so we do have these complex relationships as well that are important and mean something.
As I close, I'll just say that basically, you know, we've invested $10 billion. We'd like to know where it went to and what we're doing to prevent these outrageous fires that we're having that are harming so many people. And if we've done enough there, but we're going through the money, I understand, like Grant took Richmond, and doesn't give us very good hope right now that we're being used as effective as it could. Senator Barrasso.
Well, thanks, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Norris, so the Forest Service has come out with a 10-year strategy to combat wildfire crisis, and they announced significant spending across 21 designated areas. The dollars fund projects critical for reducing wildfire risk and defending America's forests. They're going to protect people's lives and livelihoods. Now, unbelievable to me, Wyoming is the only state located on or west of the Rocky Mountains that has not received any funding of these 21 designated areas under this strategy. Could you just outline the challenges that Wyoming is facing with respect to fire risk, as well as why you think it's so critical that the Forest Service works to protect national forests in our state?
Thank you, Senator. Wyoming's forests have the same wildfire risk as any other forest in the western states. Our forests are overstocked, they have insect and disease outbreaks, we have areas of high mortality, and our forests are primed to burn due to drought. Wyoming's forests need to be protected because of the values they provide to our communities and also to the rest of the West. Our forests provide timber supply, critical wildlife habitat, water storage and supply. Our forests are considered the headwater forests because they contain the headwaters of 4 major river basins in the West. A catastrophic wildfire would substantially impact our communities as well as many of the communities further down the stream. Thank you.
So, Ms. Hall Rivera, in April, I sent a letter along with Senator Lummis and our Representative Harriet Hageman. We sent it to Chief Moore and to Secretary Vilsack. You may have seen it, and Mr. Chairman, I'll put it in the record. The letter details our concern over Wyoming's exclusion from this 10-year strategy to address the wildfire crisis. Later that month, we had Chief Moore was here. I asked him directly why Wyoming was excluded. I'm still waiting for answers. So, Ms. Hall Rivera, does the Forest Service plan to protect Wyoming's forest under the 10-year strategy?
Thank you for that question, Senator. As you probably know, we have invested $13 million in the state of Wyoming in the past couple of years in a variety of different funds, including Joint Chiefs, CFLRP, and others. But I understand your concern about the wildfire crisis strategy investments. There are many, many places at risk in the West, as you know. The funding that we've received, we are very grateful for, but we've said multiple times, is a down payment on all the work that needs to be done in this country. And as we look at further announcements or get additional resources, we will take a hard look at Wyoming.
Well, I believe this is an egregious omission, and I would look to ask that you continue to work to correct this omission. Ms. Norris, this morning the Wall Street Journal published an editorial about the impact of forest fires on the environment and the need for active forest management to prevent catastrophic wildfires. The editorial, Wildfires and the Progressive Climate Deniers. It goes on, it says, government land management policies that prevent wildfires from spreading out of control would actually reduce CO2 emissions more than offshore wind or electric vehicle mandates. Alas, it says, this doesn't fit with the climate left's book of revelations. Do you agree that active forest management, such as cutting trees that are at risk, higher risk of burning, is not only critical to saving lives and property in our forests, but also helps combat climate change?
Thank you, Senator. I agree. That's an easy question. Yes, active management is needed. It's needed to help us with our mitigating the negative impacts from wildfire. A great example was in my testimony, which was in the Fish Creek fire fuel break, where we were able to control that fire and stop it from burning down homes and affecting people's lives. So yes, active management is the answer.
So, Ms. Hall Rivera, I see you're shaking your head. Yes, I know that the Forest Service, though, is spending time and money on policies like your old growth inventory that promise to make active management more difficult, it seems to me, when clearly increasing forest treatments should be the top priority.
Yeah, Senator, we absolutely agree with you. That's why we're focusing on significantly scaling up our treatments as a result of our wildfire crisis strategy. We absolutely need more active management in our forests if we're going to combat this wildfire crisis.
And then, Mr. Chair, my final question for Ms. Norris is, we've heard today Congress will need to act in order to ensure the federal agencies can recruit and retain a wildland firefighter workforce. Can you elaborate on how much Wyoming depends on partnerships with wildland firefighters to help defend our forests in terms of how vital it is for Wyoming to be fully staffed?
Thank you, Senator. It's vital. The federal government owns 48% of the state and is responsible for 48% of that to suppress. Our wildfire community is interdependent, and any reduction in capacity will substantially impact our ability to respond. Wyoming simply does not have the resources to respond to an additional 48% of the state, and we need our federal partners to be a dependable partner in the wildfire response.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. And now we have Senator Heinrich.
Thank you, Chairman. I want to start out and just say it would be irresponsible to have this hearing and not consider the role that climate change is playing in the fires that we're experiencing in the West in particular, and now in Canada as well, of course. Due to climate change, some of the things that have changed is that we used to have these historic reservoirs of moisture in both forest soils and in standing timber. And one of the things we've experienced in New Mexico is that during these long drought periods driven by the changes we're seeing in our climate, there are times when there is more moisture in a 2x4 at Home Depot than there is in a standing live ponderosa pine in our forests in New Mexico. So for Mr. Rupert or Ms. Hall Rivera, can you talk a little bit about the role that climate is changing, or climate change is playing in the kind of seasons and fire behavior we're seeing? And then two, the issue of active management, because one of the things that I have seen in successful treatments where we're managing our forests is that the treatments we need remove the small ladder fuels. They oftentimes leave the large standing timber that sequesters most of the carbon. So if you could respond to that with respect to what Senator Barrasso was asking and the relationship there.
Well, sure. I think, as you point out, the effect of climate, more extreme swings in how climate affects weather. So we go through these periods of extreme drought, lengthy extreme drought, and that has an effect on that fuel moisture. That absolutely is a huge part of driving these catastrophic megafires that we're experiencing. Active management, important because another factor along with climate that does affect the current status of wildfire in the nation is related to largely our past practice of fire suppression, active fire suppression. We are really good at putting out fires, and granted, we have these mega fires that we're unable to initially respond to and suppress, but in the average year, there are between 60 and 70,000 wildfires in this nation. The vast majority of those fires we put out. And again, the result of that is we have this accumulated fuel that is now drying. And active management, important part of addressing that, all the tools in the toolbox. I would point out, to your point, those fine fuels, there's really good, solid science support at this point that in addition to mechanical treatment, in addition to all the biomass approach we have, thinning, grazing, prescribed fire, reintroducing fire to really address that point you make, those fine fuels, is an important piece that can't be left out in these fire-adapted systems.
Generally agree, Ms. Hall Rivera.
Yes, I do. I don't think I have
I'm
anything
running
I could
out of
add.
time, so I want to ask both of you too. We've seen proposed from our colleagues in the House of Representatives potentially double-digit cuts across many government agencies. What would those kinds of reductions in budget do to our wildland firefighter force?
Well, that coupled with the pay cliff would be pretty catastrophic for our fire workforce. We know that if we're not able to get a change in pay status for our firefighters, that we're going to see many of them go to higher paying jobs where they can make a living wage and support their families. We are hearing from our firefighting union that we could lose 30 to 50% of our firefighting workforce in the Forest Service. That would be devastating.
30 to 50%.
Yes.
Yeah. Talk a little bit about the temporary pay increase and how important it's going to be to make that a permanent pay increase.
Yeah, we absolutely need that, Senator, so that we can keep our firefighting workforce, so we can retain them and recruit new folks into this work, take care of them, help them have a healthier work-life balance, and pay them what they deserve to be paid for the hazardous work that they are doing.
I would just real briefly add to that. So we know that we've seen firefighters who have made the choice not to retire as a result of the pay support that we've been able to provide over the last 2 years. We've also had success expanding our capacity. We are seeing more firefighters come in. If we lose the ability to provide that pay support, as Jalith points out, we recognize we're going to be impacted on both the recruitment and the retention side.
Great. Thank you both.
Senator Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Smoke from wildfires in Canada has blanketed the northeastern United States, including here in Washington. I checked the air quality index this morning, and it's 313, which is considered hazardous. This is rarely seen in the United States and is not healthy, to put it mildly. And I'm sure many of us have seen pictures of the thick smoke in New York City over the last couple of days, which yesterday had the very worst air quality among all the world's major cities. Now, most Easterners aren't used to dealing with this level of smoke. And by Easterners, I mean basically anybody to the east of Colorado. But this is an unfortunate recurring reality for us in the West. This is a picture of downtown Salt Lake City. Now, Salt Lake City doesn't look like this normally. But from time to time, we have these neighbors. I mean, here we've got Canada to deal with. We've got California in Utah, hundreds of miles away, and yet they have fires. And when they have fires, this is what those fires do to us. They blanket us in this thick, oppressive layer of smoke. And it can create dangerous air quality levels, just as this is done in the eastern United States this week. But that's just an August day when wildfires burn in places like California, and then the smoke blows over to us. The Western fires usually don't cause quite the national stir that we've seen in the last few days, even though this is something we deal with some regularity. But they ought to be of concern to all of us, because they do happen, and for us, they happen quite frequently. The reason these fires have become so severe and so frequent in the West is because of unwise forest management practices on land that is owned and controlled by the federal government. And the reality is that over the last century or so, we've had this paradox unfold in front of us, in which federal land managers have in some ways gone too far in aggressively suppressing the naturally occurring wildfires, leading to overgrown and unhealthy forests. And in other respects, it's overaction. In other areas, it's underaction, failure to undertake aggressive forest management practices that could control for some of this. So we've got these western forests that are dense and dehydrated, yet federal land managers are often prohibited from dealing with the situation in the way in which it requires, because of restrictive federal land designations and permitting processes for active management activities. Ms. Norris, I'd like to start with you. As a Wyomingite, you're familiar with many of these problems. There seems to be a really stark difference between forest health on federal forest land and other categories of federal land compared to private and state-owned land with trees on it. From your experience in Wyoming, why is this stark difference? Why is it so stark? Why do private and state-owned forests fare so much better in this area?
Thank you, Senator. I believe that has a lot to do with the states and private landowners' flexibility and being able to get things done on the ground quickly. And it appears sometimes our federal partners, through the NEPA process, through certain processes, it takes them much longer to get the work done on the ground. And things don't necessarily always end up in the desired condition maybe they had intended.
And by flexibility, you mean it's not the quality of the personnel, it's the legal restrictions by which they're bound. What they're allowed to do is different than it is on federal land. Is that right?
Correct.
Now, Ms. Hall Rivera, I suspect we can agree that active forest management should be a part of any conversation on permitting reform. What reforms do you think would be helpful to streamline active management activities like mechanical thinning and controlled burns?
Yeah, thank you, Senator. We absolutely agree that active management is a critical part of the conversation. That's what we're focused on in our wildfire crisis strategy. We're taking advantage of every tool that we have in the toolbox right now, every flexibility that we have, including the Secretary recently declaring emergency authorizations for us to use those provisions in bill, and we are using those. We have 6 projects in so far. I have no doubt we'll get more. If there are additional tools that you'd like to give us in the toolbox, we'd be happy to work with you on those.
We'd love to, and my time's running out, but just considering the wildfire crisis in the West and that it is an ongoing, recurring, severe problem, do you think that the current approach to forest management by federal agencies is sustainable?
Well, what we do know is we certainly need a paradigm shift and that we need to significantly scale up that work, both on national forests, but also on state, private, other lands as well.
Although it's on state and private lands, we don't have the same problem. It's not.
No, but we do need to work across boundaries and work in partnership, as we've talked about today. So we know we need to scale up. We appreciate the resources we've been given to start doing that, and we'll need to continue to have resources invested in this problem in the future.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr.
Senator
Chair.
Cantwell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I think America is waking up, at least on the East Coast, to this problem, and we certainly have known all about it on the West Coast for some time now. And I think that it is a time and opportunity for us to really break down the barriers that are prohibiting us from having a faster response and work quickly on the faster response. Unfortunately for us, the latest map of the forecast for this summer, I think the last time we showed this at our last hearing, Mr. Chairman, there was a little bit of Washington in the red, but now my whole state is in the forecast for this summer being in the epicenter of this. We know this already because we have been affected by the British Columbia fires that are affecting our state. It's smoke, but we also know that there are small fires already burning in central Washington and a small fire in Yakima County, which grew to 150 acres last night. So first and foremost, I believe that we need better cooperation between the Forest Service and the state to break down any barriers that are preventing us from having a quick aviation response. That is, being able to, on the ground, we have something that is very effective in having people work collectively on identifying fires and responding. So one, we need to break down those aviation barriers and get a faster response. We need to implement the technology communication tools that we asked the Forest Service about at the last hearing that gives us, again, communication directly to where the fire is and what we're doing in response. And third, I think it's really time to engage with the Canadians. We can't just be sitting here thinking that we have solved this problem because our continent knows no U.S.-Canadian barrier. And if we're going to have management service, and I've been a huge supporter of cross-laminated timber as a fire break issue, I've been a huge supporter of moving the time period by where we do subscribe burns. There's probably hardly any time now to do subscribe burns in the middle of summer. It just doesn't happen. Mr. Chairman, I think some of my colleagues probably get this, but literally the reason why people didn't do subscribe burns in the springtime is because people are like, well, there'll be some smoke. Well, because we're not doing prescribed burns, we're getting a whole lot of smoke, okay? So the point is, let's change our management system response so that we can reduce fire risk. This summer is telling us we need to do that now. So if I could, Ms. Hall-Rivera, response on both the implementation of breaking down barriers on aviation and getting the communication technology network up as soon as possible.
Yes, Senator, thank you for all those points. I would agree with all of them. We absolutely need to break down barriers with all of our partners, states, tribes, counties, even between the federal agencies. We are challenged at times with some interoperability issues, maybe some different qualification standards, but we're all on the same team. And fire doesn't know any boundaries. We've already heard that today. So we absolutely need to work to break down those barriers. I think we're absolutely committed to that, and we can certainly bring some attention and focus to that in Washington State if need be. As far as the need to scale up prescribed fires and some of the challenges in doing so, I think you captured that very well. Prescribed fire is absolutely critical to getting our landscapes back to a place where they can receive fire in a healthy way. It can be challenging to get windows to do that, especially in the summertime, as you pointed out. So we need to scale up that workforce, and we need to scale up the skill sets across not just the federal government, but across partners so that we can get more prescribed fire on the ground.
On the technology front, I want to note the U.S. Border Patrol recently equipped 19,000 agents with this gear without being obligated to do so. So if the U.S. Border Patrol can do it, why can't we upgrade people right away with this gear?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Senator. We are focused on getting tracking systems out. We have done a lot of pilot testing as a result of the Dingle Act, and we appreciate the focus and attention on this technology. We're going to be equipping our fire fleet with tracking devices this year, and we have a request for proposals coming out very soon so we can take advantage of those technology companies and what they have out in the marketplace, like you just mentioned with Border Patrol.
Well, I think my former colleague from Colorado and I worked very hard on this, and we think it's long overdue to be implemented. I think this fire season will really want it to happen. And I don't know if I'm being followed by my colleague from Idaho, but this good neighbor concept in general is about how do we get the front line. We actually have maps where we can see right up to where the federal line is. Why? Because the county or the community provided a response, but then all of a sudden couldn't cross the federal lines. I think we need to think about how we're going to empower local communities to help us when these kinds of conditions are so drastic. And so I know my colleague from Idaho is working on that and will continue to dialogue with this committee. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. And Senator Risch is next.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's really appropriate to be holding this hearing. For those of you who live on the East Coast, welcome to our air in the West. This is common. I don't remember a summer in Boise when we haven't had smoke. Sometimes it's much worse than others. We've had some summers that were really catastrophic in this regard, but this is what we live with. I mean, this is just the way it is. So for me, from that standpoint, this is an important hearing. It's an important issue. On a personal note, my undergrad was in forestry, specifically forest management. Probably not many in Congress have actually worked on a fire line, but I have a number of times. In addition to that, we had some catastrophic fires when I was governor that we had to deal with. And so this is an issue that, and of course, Boise's home to the National Interagency Fire Center. So if you get a fire, you're going to get a visit from some Idahoans to try to help you put it out. So this is really important. Look, for years, we have focused on putting out fires, and we were very, very successful at it. And by being successful at it, we've caused the problem that we've got, and that is the West particularly burns every year. It's part of the natural process. But if it doesn't burn, because we put the fires out, we control the fires, then what you get is catastrophic fires. Okay, so we understand that. Now you got to manage it, and that is you got to remove fuel, or you've got to handle it in such a way that fuel is in places where, if it's in a wilderness or something like that, that they can let it burn. But we've got to stop wasting limited agency resources to needlessly redo and relitigate projects that have already undergone extensive environmental and public processes. Senator Daines and I have worked for quite some time to get the Cottonwood fix passed. I was glad to see it passed again through our committee, but now it's time to get the thing across the finish line. We also need to make significant headway with fuels reduction projects. It's good to hear that the agencies are putting together plans, but without additional consistent work, we will continue to feed the flames. I recently introduced the Firesheds Act with Ranking Member Barrasso and Senators Daines and Crapo to address landscapes at extreme high risk of catastrophic fire. My bill will allow states to work closely with federal agencies across the boundaries to conduct management projects on fire sheds, which constitute the highest risk to communities, wildlife, and quality management. These projects will cut through red tape while instituting a proactive, responsible, collaborative process. Now, I think what people need to understand is these things, every landscape is different. Every acre is different, and they all need a different attention. We're next to my friends in Colorado who have a roadless rule. We in Idaho have a roadless rule. I wrote it when I was governor. And one of the things that we really focused on in there was we have a lot of backcountry communities, small towns. And so we really concentrate on removing fuel in a circle around those towns, and it's been very successful. There's been at least one dramatic save of an entire community because they did fuel removal. So these are all things that we can focus on. We're getting a lot better at it. We're getting smarter at it. My state is home to probably the most famous forest fire ever, the Big Burn back in 1910. I wasn't there. My kids think I was. But we learned a lot of lessons from that, not the least of which was that we had been so successful in fire suppression that we just thought if you just suppress the fires that's the end of it. That is not the end of it. The fuel's going to go. It's either got to be burned out or it's got to be removed, and that's the way we got to approach these things. So with that, thanks for the hearing. We need to all pull the wagon together.
But my colleague, you do support cross-laminated timber as one of the ways to reduce that.
Clearly.
Thank you.
I'm not going under oath, though, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. And now we have Senator Kaine. You're up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, Ms. Norris, I want to welcome you particularly and share with you one of my dearest friends in Maine is a woman named Sue Bell. And Sue Bell was the first female state forester in America in the early 90s. So you owe something to my friend Sue Bell. We're delighted to have you with us here today. Also, Senator Barrasso talked about, or Senator Lee talked about where the West started and ended in Colorado. In New England, the Midwest starts at Springfield, Mass., just so you know where those lines are. At least that's the way we view it in Maine. It seems to me that the key words today that I've heard over and over are overstock and drought. And drought is a climate issue, as Senator Heinrich pointed out. And that's something we're working on a whole lot of different fronts in terms of reducing CO2 in the atmosphere and reducing the drastic effects of climate change, one of which is wildfires. The overstocking, though, is something we can address directly. Between 1965 and I think 1990, the average amount of wood taken out of the federal forest was about 12 billion board feet. Since 2001, that's 2.2 billion board feet. That's the problem, is too much junk wood and understory in the forest. And Mr. Rupert, I don't want to embarrass you, but you talked very proudly about 2.1 million acres are going to be treated next year. I figured that'll get us to the full forest in 60 years. Come on. And the solution is right in front of us, which is there are people that want to harvest wood in the forest, and we should figure out a way to let them do so in an environmentally sound manner. I'm convinced that can be the case, because the disparity between 12 to 13 billion and 2 billion, there's got to be a right number somewhere in that, between those two. So how do we significantly increase harvesting? And I think the testimony is accurate that we have a lot lower fire risk on private land and on state-owned land because it's more heavily managed. Mr. Rupert, how do we break through and get to the point where we're taking out the understory and the junk wood and the fuel so that we can really get at the bottom of this problem? And then we don't, a whole lot of other issues can become much more manageable.
Yeah, thank you, Senator. And I do very briefly want to make the point that, so in Interior, we're administering about 500 million acres across the nation. Maybe 1 in 5 of those acres is forested. 4 in 5 are not forested.
Yeah, my calculation was your forestry plus U.S. Forest Service.
But to your point, I think, how do we have more? I think as you look across the country where we're having success, is where we're collaborating, coordinating, partnering at scale. So we talk about landscapes, we talk about watersheds. That's a scale where individual parties on the ground, local communities, local landowners, local interested parties have a seat at the table to share in a strategy to identify shared values to protect. And I think that's the key, is that scale piece.
But part of the shared value ought to be CO2 in the atmosphere. And these fires are giving us a lot of CO2 in the atmosphere that can be offset. And there are environmental issues surrounding cutting. I understand that. I'm from the most forested state in the country, and when I was governor, we passed a very strong Forest Practices Act. I get that. However, we're not taking cognizance of the big picture, which is the CO2 released by these catastrophic fires. It may be that we need to have more cutting in order to prevent that CO2. Do you see? I think I can make a strong environmental case for this argument. You're nodding, Ms.
Yes, we agree, Senator. We need
Nods
to.
don't go in the record.
Right. Yeah. We agree. We need to scale up all kinds of treatment, hazardous fuels treatment, but also timber management. That's one of our critical tools in the toolbox.
One of the bills I've submitted, which goes along with the list that Senator Barrasso gave about different bills addressing this, is one that would allow would say that the Fire Service can allow less than 8-inch trees to be removed for free. And it would incentivize reducing, again, the fuel load in the forest, because a lot of this is the smaller, the undergrowth, and also dead and dying trees that ought to be gotten out. So I hope that the Fire Service can really look at this and come back to us and say, okay, why did we go from 13 to 2? And how do we change that in an environmentally sound manner? Can you take that as a question for the record?
Yes, we'll absolutely do that, Senator.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Murkowski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here this morning. Obviously, a very, very timely meeting. You know, it's interesting following my colleague. We're co-chairs of the Arctic Caucus, and it's been interesting that as I visit with fellow Arctic parliamentarians about the issues of the day in their respective countries, in these Arctic nations, on everyone's radar now is what is happening with these fires in Arctic environments. We never used to have to worry about that on tundra. We're just seeing significant changes, and as I look at the wildfire outlook, once again, Alaska's got way more red than we want. It's interesting, though, that as we speak and we're receiving the impact from the Canadian fires, some of our Alaska hotshot crews are helping out in Canada. We've sent some aircraft in Canada. Typically, this time of year, we can't afford to send anybody anything. In fact, we are asking for support, whether it's support from the lower 48, from our friends in Idaho, from our friends in Canada. We've got a later season, that's good. I'm going to be asking you a question, Mr. Rupert, as to whether or not you think the late breakup that we're seeing in Alaska and the snowmelt indicate that we're going to see a lighter fire season, or whether it's just going to be pushed a month later. But before I get to that question, I want to ask a little bit more about the coordination, if you will, or cooperation between the United States and Canada. As you know, in Alaska, we have a significant northern border with Canada. This is an area that is prone to wildfire. In fact, if you look at that map, it's that whole border is in red. How are we doing with just the level of coordination internationally? What more do we need to be doing? And then, Mr. Rupert, if you can just answer my question about what you see. Is Alaska going to be late, or are we going to be light? We'd really like to be light, because we're always pretty heavy here.
Well, in terms of the relationship with Canada, so there's a bilateral agreement in place. It's been in place for many years. To your point, we regularly share resources back and forth. We pay it forward
Right.
All the time. So right now, fortunately, it's at a period where providing that support to Canada has been very manageable. We've had, up to this point, over 600 personnel that have been mobilized to Canada. I think today there are right around 350 folks there. We have additional requests, additional mobilizations that are coming through right now, including with support specifically like to Eastern Canada, Quebec, again, talking about all the smoke impact that the Eastern U.S. is experiencing. Canada has provided support to us during really difficult times. For example, during the pandemic, that was not easy. 2019 was a big year sharing resources. That was a hard year for all of us. So there's a great relationship and a great history there, and I think every reason to expect that's going to continue to be the case. Specifically, in Alaska, I was just in Alaska a couple weeks ago, spent time at Fairbanks at AFS, at Wainwright there. And preparations are very much ongoing. AFS is very squared away, and they're preparing. We have seen a fairly dramatic shift in the outlook in Alaska. To your point, a month ago, all that red was not there. We did talk with Predictive Services while we were up there. The point they made is with sort of precipitation over the winter, early spring in Alaska. At that time, just a couple of weeks ago, it was really sort of uncertain how that was going to go. Now, fast forward just a couple of weeks, and it's pretty clear that as things are starting to dry now there is a real likelihood of above normal activity in Alaska. And
So above normal, a little bit later in the season, but is this going to extend us later? You don't necessarily know.
So-
But
so
we're
the-
going to be above normal is what you're
yeah,
saying.
so the outlook looks 4 months forward, and over that time period, we are at this point anticipating there's going to be the potential for above normal fire activity.
Well, we will get ready. I'm probably going to have to take this for the record, Ms. Hall Rivera, but I've asked this question a couple times in the last couple months within the Interior Appropriations Committee and here in the Forest Service budget hearing. I haven't received a response yet from Forest Service on this, and I talk about how the tribes in Alaska are leaders in self-governance and really want to have more opportunities for tribal management, specifically with the 638 contracts and the compacts. So the Farm Bill had authorized the 638 compacting for Tribal Forest Protection Act projects, but the authority is limited to projects on federal lands that border or are adjacent to the Indian forest or rangeland. So we got some technical assistance from USDA that may help, but we also want to do what we can in expanding these 638 contracting and compacting to additional activities. So we're hoping that you'll be willing to work with us and explore that further.
Yes, absolutely, Senator.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
On behalf of the chairman, Senator Kelly has agreed to defer to Senator Daines.
Senator Kelly, thank you, by the way. Senator King, thank you as well. When you woke up this morning in Washington, you might have opened your windows up and heard the birds coughing outside. It's no secret that wildfire season is upon us. My guess is that folks on the East Coast are already sick of the smoke. We're already hearing about ground stops in the Philadelphia airport, slowdowns at LaGuardia because of visibility issues with the smoke. Look, this is what we deal with out west virtually every summer. I keep beautiful pictures of the landscapes of Montana, my hometown, and there in the Gallatin Valley, so that when we have our friends during tourist season and family that come out to Montana, I can show them the pictures of what the mountains look like if you could see them. But they're covered up in smoke oftentimes when we turn the corner in July, August, and into September. We're sick of that smoke. I know the folks on the East Coast are, and we need to do something to try to reduce the risk of these fires. What happens in Montana is that we have environmental groups who litigate and stop forest treatment projects with a sympathetic judge or two within the Ninth Circuit Court, and we end up tying some 130 million board feet of timber in Montana tied up in litigation. Look, this is not about trying to make ideological points at the moment. I'm focused on solving this problem. There's no doubt we've got longer fire seasons, we've got warmer summers, so what's the mitigation strategy going to be as we try to address this core problem? And forest treatment projects should be one of our deployed strategies. We've got to cut the red tape, we've got to combat the fringe litigation, we've got to solve this problem. If we don't act, these catastrophic wildfires will continue to threaten lives. They'll burn millions of acres a year, spending untold millions of dollars in fighting these fires, putting firefighters at risk. Tragically, we lose the lives. Lives are lost with our firefighters every fire season. Billions of dollars of infrastructure destroyed, and our forest communities put at risk. They're getting harder to fight. They're getting more dangerous to fight because we haven't addressed reducing fuel loads. These fires get hotter, and frankly, they're even more catastrophic. The Forest Service and DOI together now have over 100 million acres at high risk of wildfire. These are a tinderbox. They're waiting to burn if we don't make some changes on how we manage our public lands. On May 17th, my bipartisan Ninth Circuit Cottonwood Fix legislation passed out of this committee by a voice vote. I'm thankful, grateful for my colleagues on both sides of this dais who unanimously supported the voice vote to move that forward out of committee. Getting this fix signed into law by the president is vital, since needed forest management needs to continue versus being delayed by litigation. You talk to anybody who's close to this problem, they'll tell you get that Ninth Circuit Cottonwood fix signed into law, and we suddenly have reduced one of the major barriers to treatment and forest management. And by the way, forest management yields some very important benefits. Wildlife habitat improvements by getting more sunlight on the forest floors to provide for better feed. Watersheds, because we have massive wildfires. Of course, you have big erosion in the spring that gets into the streams that harms trout habitat in Montana. You've got, of course, reducing the risk of wildfires, but let's not forget the importance of getting workers back in the forest. These public lands don't pay, there's no revenue coming off of them because the radical environmentalists have shut down the industry. We get workers back in there, getting revenues back to some of my impoverished counties, getting our loggers back in the forest, versus right now it's a bunch of lawyers. Forest Service Chief Moore and Deputy Chief French have both testified that the reconsultation requirement on the 87 forest plans will negatively impact the Forest Service work to prevent out-of-control wildfires. This ties right back to that Ninth Circuit cottonwood problem. Deputy Chief Hall Rivera, do you agree with them that the Ninth Circuit cottonwood reconsultation requirement will delay landscape scale management that is needed to help combat catastrophic wildfires?
Yes, Senator, I would concur with what the Chief and Deputy Chief French have already put on the record.
Over the past 2 decades, and thank you for that response, over the past 2 decades, wildfires have become hotter, longer burning, more damaging. And let's not forget that a catastrophic wildfire is a carbon emitter. A healthy, vibrant forest is a carbon sink. We now talk about having a fire year versus a fire season. This puts strain on wildland firefighters. Year after year, they battle at more complex, dangerous fires for longer. In 21, I worked on a bipartisan manner with Senator Feinstein to secure recognition of the work that wildland firefighters do by passing our bill to create a title that reflects their actual job of fighting fires and getting them a badly needed pay raise. Director Rupert and Deputy Chief Hall Rivera, could you talk briefly, because I'm out of time, about how the title change and the pay increase has impacted recruitment and retention of wildlife firefighters at the agencies? Start with Mr. Rupert.
Yeah, thank you. Really briefly, it certainly helped. I'm aware that we've seen firefighters that have made a decision or delayed retirement as a result of the support, the increased support, as well as on then the recruitment side. We have had success recruiting additional firefighters and have continued to focus on expanding our capacity and recognize an important part of that effort is not only the pay support, but also the support for a full career that goes along with all of the work, for example, that's been done to establish the new series. So,
Director Rupert, thank you. Any additional comments there?
Yes, Senator, I would just say that we know that the temporary bill pay increase has helped us retain some of our workforce who might have left otherwise, certainly has brought some new workers into our firefighting workforce, and that's why it's absolutely critical that we avert the pay cliff and put something permanent into place.
Thank you. And that pay cliff is September, by the way, where this pay raise expires,
Yes.
unless we take action here in Congress. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Kelly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So we are currently experiencing the worst drought in 1,200 years in the West. The forest is dry. Every fire season, it seems these fires get worse and worse. And now we're seeing this in other parts of the continent with the fires going on in Canada today. Here's a satellite image, and I'll show this for the record. And you can clearly see, the smoke over the eastern seaboard. New York City today has reported the worst air quality in the world, though when I check the air quality index for New York, it's currently 199, and in D.C. it's 273. So I would argue maybe here in Washington it is possibly the worst, or at least close to the worst on the planet. Well, this is something we see in Arizona year after year, especially in the northern parts of the state. Wildfires are just burning hotter, and it's a challenge to fight them. So last Congress, Senator Romney and I added legislation to the bipartisan infrastructure law that created a wildfire Mitigation and Management Commission that is meeting today, 18 members who are going to report out in September with their recommendations. You know, how do we do a better job fighting wildfires? I've been in the United States Senate just a short period of time and through a few fire seasons, and what I've seen is we basically do the same thing each year and hope for a better result. Well, we're not going to get a better result unless we make some changes. Senator Dean said if we don't act, this will continue to be a problem, and I do agree with that, and he spoke about healthy forests. We have a project in Arizona, the Forest Initiative, the biggest ponderosa pine forest in the world, just burns every year because it is just not a healthy forest. So we've got to move that forward. We've got to act. We've got to be more proactive and come up with some new ideas. So I'm looking forward to these recommendations that we should see in September and possibly get these implemented. But also in the bipartisan infrastructure law was a requirement of a new classification, a distinct classification of a wildland firefighter job classification. And it's my understanding that the Forest Service and the Interior Department are in different places regarding the implementation of this. Well, that was required under the law. So, Director Rupert, I'm interested, where is Interior on the implementation of this occupational series of wildland firefighter?
Thank you for the question, Senator. So the development of the series has very much been a joint collaborative effort between USDA, Interior, as well as OPM. The new series was established almost a year ago, 0456. In Interior, we've been hard at work. This has also been collaborative work. Taking the new series and developing actual position descriptions. The current status of that is in Interior is we have sort of our standard wildland firefighting positions, grade GS3 through 10, with PDs that are ready to go that we're beginning to use. We still have additional work to do, especially as you get into some of the more specialized firefighting positions and the position descriptions that'll go along with it. But we have made real progress with developing position descriptions and have begun to implement the use of them.
And Deputy Chief Hall Rivera, has the Forest Service implemented this occupational series as well?
So we are in a similar place to the Department of the Interior, and we have worked collaboratively together up until now. But we are going on a little bit of a slower timeline, and we've worked with OPM to secure an extension to the end of the calendar year. The reasons that we're doing that are a couple. There's significant complexity in the Forest Service. We have hundreds of position descriptions that could be going into this new series. And so what we want to do is make sure that we build in time to get it right. And what that means is making sure that we can engage with our firefighting employees, our union, and our fire supervisors to make sure we get those details right before we put them into the new series. So that is why we are in a bit of a timing difference than the Department of the Interior. We have over 12,000 firefighters and, like I said, hundreds of position descriptions. So from my perspective, it's a go slow to go fast and to go right.
So worst case, when would you expect that you would hire somebody new, not somebody that's already a new classification, but your next wildland firefighter under this classification?
I would expect that would happen next calendar year, Senator.
All right, thank you. And thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. I'm going to just one quick round. Senator Cortez Masto, I think it's your turn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Sorry.
Not a problem. So similar to my colleagues from the West, don't want to just beat this to death, but just to put it in perspective, 2020, the August complex fire in Northern California burned 1,032,000 acres. And that's an area larger than the state of Rhode Island. In 2021, this is true. In 2021, the Dixie Fire burned 963,000 acres, along with the Caldor Fire at the same time burned 221,000 acres. Some of that was man-made, some of that was caused by lightning. And The reason I bring this up is because, true to what you just saw in Utah, the smoke there was caused by these fires. We see that in Nevada. We see that all across the West. It looked just like that. And my goal here has been, as I talk with my firefighters in my state, both state, local, and federal, we've had summits. Thank you very much. Forest Service has been at the table, so has Department of Interior. How do we ensure that we're providing all of the resources we need to combat these fires that are hotter and longer, and to keep our firefighters safe and our communities safe? One of the things I want to bring up is a key part of the firefighting is our Air National Guard in Nevada. The 152nd Airlift Wing has 8 legacy C-130H aircraft with the modular airborne firefighting systems. Are you familiar with this system, Ms. Hall Rivera?
Yes, I am, Senator.
So the Air National Guard is utilizing these aircraft to fight fires along the West. They are looking for the C-130Js that has the new system associated with it. Why is that important to have this new system and the C-130Js?
Well, it's always important to have the most modern aircraft that you can get in the firefighting environment. The C-130J is an excellent aircraft to be used as an air tanker, either one that's converted or, in this case, the MAFs where it rolls on. And we have a few of those in our contracted fleet as well.
And the goal here is to give them the most up-to-date equipment to fight these fires. And my understanding is it can contain up to 3,000 gallons of flame retardant to help suppress fires by dropping more of this flame retardant. And these fires are fought by the Air National Guard in the western states. It's not just because they're in Nevada, it's unique to Nevada. They are out fighting fires. Is that correct?
Yes, so the MAFs program, as we call it, is a long-time partnership that we've had with the Department of Defense, and essentially they are modular systems that roll onto the aircraft and then are able to drop retardant. And we work with lots of different units, including Nevada. We have units in California and other places that partner with us and provide those aircraft, the personnel, and the retardant systems.
Thank you. And I bring that up because I want my colleagues to understand why the request is coming from Nevada for an Air National Guard for the newest model of these C-130Js. It is important for our firefighting in the western states. Let me jump back to the compensation issue because this is, again, thank you, Mr. Johnson, for your report. This is exactly what I'm hearing from our firefighters in the state of Nevada. And clearly more has to be done to provide permanent and better compensation. We also have to provide the affordable housing opportunities that are so necessary for the reasons that we have just talked about. The bipartisan infrastructure package provided over $600 million to the Forest Service, about $480 million, and then Department of Interior $120 million to temporarily increase that base firefighter salary for the reasons we were hearing. But let me ask you this, it's falling off. Their money's no longer going to be there after a certain period of time. So for purposes of, I guess, DOI and the U.S. Forest Service, if Congress doesn't pass a bill to extend the pay increase by the time these funds run out, what happens?
Well, I think it would be absolutely catastrophic, Senator. I stated earlier, and I'll restate it. Our union is telling us they would expect 30 to 50% of our firefighting workforce would leave our service and go elsewhere, as they should, to make a living wage and the right kind of compensation that they deserve to be paid. We are starting to see some resignations now. People are not gonna wait until September 30th.
And does that include, let's talk about the specifics, the hotshot crews, the smoke jumpers, right? Losing qualified, skilled professionals in this area fighting fires in wildfires.
Yes, you make a really important point, Senator, that we would lose those folks who are leaders in the fire service, who have the most institutional knowledge, and that would be incredibly difficult for us to replace because it takes years and years of experience to get that kind of knowledge and expertise.
Thank you. And I know my time is up. I'm going to submit this for the question, Mr. Rupert, because I do absolutely want to hear from you as well. But I also have concerns hearing from my firefighters, particularly Todd Inglesby, he's a fellow Nevadan president of the Professional Firefighters of Nevada, about the concerns about the physical and mental health that multiple deployments have on our firefighters. What does that mean, and is that having an impact on what we're seeing in the loss of so many firefighters?
So you're hearing that feedback from firefighters in Nevada. There's good, solid evidence now from studies that is in fact the case. Firefighters are at a elevated and greater risk of PTSD and anxiety as a result of those repeated deployments and long hours. And It's an opportunity to highlight, so we talked about pay. Another aspect of the proposal we have moving forward is about capacity. So as we reduce the number of hours that we're essentially requiring firefighters to work to address that mental health issue, we also have to have additional capacity to make up for those hours. And so these things are all interconnected in terms of how we deal with the wildland firefighter workforce reforms. Pay, capacity, mental health support, housing, all of it together is important.
Thank you.
Senator Hawley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to the witnesses for being here. I want to start with a shout out to firefighters in my state, the state of Missouri. Earlier this year, in March of this year, the Forest Service began a prescribed burn in the Mark Twain National Forest down at the southeast part of my state. And this prescribed burn was led by a new all-veteran firefighting crew, which is just tremendous. There's been great reports on it throughout the state, and I think that this is a great model for what we can do. I see you nodding along, Ms. Hall Rivera, so I'm very proud of those firefighters, very proud of these vets, and proud of the model that they are, I think, showing for the rest, or setting up for the rest of the country. Ms. Hall Rivera, let me ask you about the Forest Service role in a different regard when it comes to mining approvals for essential critical minerals. Would you agree with me that critical minerals are vital to our energy security?
Yes, I would agree with that, Senator.
The International Energy Agency estimated earlier this year that lithium demand is expected to grow by 400% by 2040. Cobalt and nickel between 200 and 250% by 2040. Copper demand supposed to go up more than double by 2040. Now, here's the thing that worries me. One nation in the world is currently refining 68% of the world's nickel. Would you care to take a guess who that might be?
I would presume China.
It is China. One nation is refining 40% of the world's copper. Want to guess who that is?
I would presume the same.
It's China. One nation has 59% of the lithium and 73% of the cobalt. Want to guess?
I'm going to say China.
It's China. You've got it. It is China. So given that, would you agree with me that it's important that we do everything we can to develop our domestic critical mineral mining here in this country?
Yes, I would agree with that, Senator.
Great. Okay, then let me ask you about the Superior National Forest in Minnesota. Earlier this year, partly at the behest of the Forest Service, the Biden administration withdrew 225,000 acres of critical mineral mining in northeastern Minnesota. This is the largest reserve of cobalt and nickel in the United States, perhaps I'm told maybe even in the world, and yet your administration shut it down. Your agency recommended that it be shut down, depriving us of these minerals, making us dependent on other nations that mine them in a completely unsafe and unsustainable way, and also making us more dependent on these foreign nations. Why?
Well, Senator, I do want to say I'm not an expert on that process. That's not a part of the Forest Service that I oversee. I know we have a lot of values to balance there, especially with the Boundary Waters Wilderness area, but I'm sure that we could get back to you with more details on the specifics of that decision.
Would you? That would be helpful, if you would. I would really appreciate it, because here's my view. My view is we shouldn't be making China richer and America poorer. My view is we have the best technology in the world to mine and develop these minerals. We know how to do it in a safe and responsible manner. We should be doing it. And listen, I've heard from people all over the country, but particularly people in this part of the country, who have said that this decision is devastating to their region economically, but I just submit it's devastating to our energy security and our national security. And at a time when I hear from this administration, climate change, climate change, climate change, we need to have reliable, sustainable sources of energy, why would we want to tie our own hands and make us and the world more dependent on China, who've got to be the worst environmental record of any nation in the world? If they're not the worst, they got to be close. So I just don't get it, and I'd appreciate you getting back to me on that. With my few remaining seconds here, Mr. Johnson, let me just ask you, in your testimony, your written testimony, you talked about barriers that federal agencies face when they're trying to recruit and retain firefighters. I agree with you that this is critically important. I want to highlight a bill that Senator Ossoff and I introduced last year called the Fire Station Improvement Act, which would cut red tape, expand the Assistance to Firefighters grant, allow new funds to improve facilities, protect the health and safety of our firefighters. Do you think an effort like that is necessary, needed, number one, and number two, what else do we need to do?
Yes, thank you, Senator. All efforts to help build capacity to address the wildfires would be very helpful. And also, as we've heard today, any efforts that because a lot of these barriers are interrelated, so dealing with some of the poor work-life balance, some of the mental health challenges, all of these will go a very long way to addressing the barriers.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Hickenlooper.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You know, the smoke that we're seeing right now in Washington is blanketing large portions of America right now is mostly coming from Canada, it's my understanding. And that, and I'm just, Mr. Rupert, why don't I start with you? My understanding is there's an argument that for years the Forest Service had what we call the Smokey the Bear approach, to put out every forest fire, and then the argument goes that that somehow made the forest overgrown and unhealthy and more vulnerable to hotter, larger fires. But Canada never really had a Smokey the Bear policy, right? My understanding.
Thank you, Senator. I'm, to be honest with you, I'm not sure sort of what that history in Canada is around kind of the public outreach that they have in place around firefighters, whether they have equivalent or not. But I think to your point, yeah, I mean, fundamentally what's driving, you know, these large catastrophic wildfires and mega fires, in addition to, you know, the weather that is associated with this changing climate, longer drought, and more extreme weather, is also fuel for the wildfires that is related to very aggressive suppression of wildfires, certainly across America and even across the continent, you know, over the last century. Now, as you get farther north, closer to the Arctic, you know, there are more fundamental shifts having to do with climate, with areas that really have never burned that now are at risk.
Right.
So as you get farther north in Canada, some of that's certainly in play.
Well, I guess the point is that the climate change is something you've got to put in your calculation, and that the expenses of air quality at this level are, you know, when you actually begin trying to itemize them, it becomes enormous. I actually had a more specific pedestrian, although air quality is pretty pedestrian, I guess, it affects each one of us. Affordable housing is obviously an issue, and certainly many Coloradans are grappling with. But in terms of firefighters, it's good to hear that you guys are all working and recognize that this is something important. What are, any of you can answer this, we'll start with you, Mr. Rupert. What are some of the challenges you face in making housing more accessible for our firefighters, and the ways you're addressing that issue?
Yeah, the real challenge and the real impact, I think, as you hit on, it's the availability of affordable housing, and really in many, many places across the nation. You know, we are asking for additional support, and that support that we're asking for is focused on renovating existing housing that we have, modernizing existing housing, and building additional housing.
Yes, I would echo that, Senator. It's a multifaceted problem. It's an availability problem. It's an affordability problem, predominantly, especially in the Western United States. Obviously, you see that in your state, some of our resort communities in particular, second home communities. That's exactly where our firefighters need to live and work. And not only do we need to increase their wages, so that can help with the affordability issue. As Mr. Rupert said, we have, as part of the administration's proposal, a $50 million investment in employee housing, but I believe we need an all-of-the-above approach. We need private sector partnerships, we need public-private partnerships, we need to look at how we can work with our communities to keep our firefighters in those communities.
Absolutely.
Yes, Senator. We do provide housing for our seasonal helitax staff so that we can compete with our federal partners, so we can offer a way for them to stay and live in the area and be able to help us. We also have additional housing we're looking at trying to build and support that fire community.
Thank you. Multi-dimension issue here. What we've heard from the stakeholders that we've talked about is largely about raising the pay because of the affordability issue. But one of the other options that came up with many of the stakeholders that we discussed was considering housing stipends. That would be a policy decision should the land management agencies and Congress would want to do that, and that would require authority. The land management agencies would need authority to be able to issue those.
Right. Again, I mean, some of the things we've seen as really encouraging are Forest Service and BLM looking at long-term leases of land that's appropriately located and not compromising our, I'm one of the biggest supporters you'll ever find of public lands, and we don't want to ever compromise that, but sometimes that real estate can be in the right place, and it can be a public-private partnership so that we can build housing for the firefighters that I think you all depend on. Let me ask you also, you see all this smoke coming down from Canada, and 2 weeks ago, we saw in Colorado, you literally could not see from the state capitol, you could not see the mountains because of the smoke that was coming down from Alberta.
Senator, could I interrupt you just 1 second?
Sure.
Can you hold that question?
Yes.
Senator King has to go.
Of course.
To preside.
I'm always, you don't even have to say another moment. I would be honored to.
I'll come right back to you.
Yield,
Okay,
of course.
Senator King.
I just want to submit for the record a chart of historical harvest levels in the Forest Service from 1905 to the present. And the other piece that I wanted to share was this chart, which is yesterday. And what's very unusual is we talk about climate. Living in the Northeast, climate always goes west to east. That's where the prevailing winds are. What's happening right now is something very unusual where the forest fire's up here and the smoke is coming back down. And because of our superior virtue, you'll notice that Maine is not in the shadow at all. But it is an interesting phenomenon, and it shows the purple is the worst air, which is in Washington, Philadelphia, New York. I just thought it was interesting talking about climate. This is a very unusual weather pattern that's created the situation that we're in right now. It's very unusual for the air to be moving north to south rather than west to east. So those are my two.
But Senator King, I also want to mention real quick, you made a valuable point. He's saying that basically the $10 billion we've invested in things you're supposed to do and basically reduce the firefighters, that he made a point that just let them go ahead and let's harvest. Let's harvest that.
They'll pay us, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, I'm saying, it doesn't cost anything. We make money. And we've solved both problems. I don't know what the problem is there. Why people don't want to cut trees. Okay. Thank you, sir. Senator Hickenlooper, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but thank you.
I'm always glad to yield to Angus King because you always learn something.
Always.
He is always looking at things from a different perspective and bringing to the surface things that might otherwise not be shared. I'll finish that statement about the kind of getting on the granular effect of these devastating fires. In Colorado, certainly at all levels of management, we're seeing the planning at the fire shed level, trying to make us more resilient from future wildfires. The Arapahoe Roosevelt National Forest is a good example of this work, where partners work strategically across the landscape about figuring out where you can get the best bang for the dollar in terms of protecting forests and the communities of people in the wildland-urban interface. So, Mr. Ruber, how does Interior think strategically about where to deploy its wildfire management resources locally in order to achieve desired outcomes at landscape scale?
Well, I think, so focusing, thank you very much, focusing initially on sort of our response, the very mature and robust framework that we have in place is focused on sort of nearest available resource, local response. We have the nation organized into geographic areas, and those geographic areas coordinate to prioritize operational wildfire response based on the nearest available resource. I think sort of then transitioning that to thinking about, okay, what are we doing before the fire, pre-fire, to reduce risk? Similarly, we have to continue, and we're making progress here, I'm certain, but we have to continue to have increasingly coordinated, multi-jurisdictional, cross-programmatic coordination and shared strategies to do a similar thing at that appropriate scale, that landscape scale, so that we're essentially developing these shared strategies to reduce risk before the fire comes, similar to how, in many ways we respond to wildfires when they do occur.
All right. Ms. Torres, you agree that in Wyoming?
Yeah, and we completely agree. One of our best tools is the Good Neighbor Authority agreement, and through that agreement, State Forestry has really worked hard with our federal partners to get more work done on the ground. And it's all different kinds of work. It's timber sales as well as additional project work, and now looking at even trying to get the NEPA done, contracting out assessments, and trying to do things like that to help our federal partners.
Well, I think that's even some of the discussions about copper and mining and a lot of these things, we are having to look at them in a new light. And as far as NEPA, each of these historical, important sets of rules, we have to examine in the light of climate change and recognize there's an urgency there that we haven't had before. Anyway, Ms. Hall Rivera, you want to answer that question too in terms of the resiliency, the planning for resiliency within the forest?
Yeah, I'd absolutely echo what my colleague said. We need to focus and prioritize at a larger scale. That's fundamentally what our 10-year wildfire crisis strategy is about. And it needs to be cross-boundary. It needs to be with partners, absolutely needs to be co-prioritized with states, with tribes, with local areas, counties, and with interior as well. And so that's the paradigm shift we talk about in our wildfire crisis strategy, and that's what we are trying to make a reality with the investments that we've been given from Congress.
Right. Mr. Johnson, anything to add?
Thank you. So no, I think that it's very important as we are addressing this issue for the partnerships to continue that are being formed, with the federal government and the state and local level, because I think through those partnerships is how things will end up progressing and moving forward and leveraging all authorities that they have. Thank you.
Right. Well, I'm almost out of time, and I think I got extra time by being interrupted, which I appreciate.
You're definitely out of time.
But I'm not now. I'm still not now. I've got a clock running, and I've watched enough basketball games to know that clock, the buzzer hasn't gone off. I do want to, you each talk about collaboration, and that takes more time, more money, more people, and yet it is crucial, and yet we're going to likely enter a phase where we're not going to have more money. And I hope I'll leave you with this thought, or you'll come back to, maybe I'll leave the question in the record, is how do we getting to that more effective collaborative response in these issues where you got to have BLM and the Forest Service, everybody's got to be working together at a level we've talked about but never done. How do we do that efficiently so that we can afford it? And I'll leave you with that. I yield back to the chair.
Oh, thank you so much. Real quick, we get one in the record, and then we got to adjourn. The National Fire Protection Association recently released a Standard 1851, regarding best practices to prevent development of cancers commonly caused by firefighting activities. They note that for every 5 degrees of increase in skin temperature, there is a 400% increase in the absorption capability of our skin, and that firefighters should prioritize getting soot, which is a carcinogen, off their skin as soon as possible. Mr. Rupert, Mr. Rivera, what are the agencies doing to comply with the standard, and are they informing the firefighters this information?
Yeah, so thank you very much. Hugely important, the health and safety of wildland firefighters. Those sort of standard operational procedures, very much a focus and priority across the entire interagency community. A specific example I would offer to sort of illustrate that focus, the interagency community established a public health, medical and public health advisory team during COVID. It was really impactful in terms of how we coordinated.
The firefighters know about this, and they've been notified.
Yeah, and that group is picking up on these themes and very much focusing on how do we more effectively.
Well, let us know how we can help.
That.
Okay?
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you. Members are going to have until close of business tomorrow to submit additional questions for the record. And I want to thank each and every one of you. It was very enlightening. It was very good. We got a lot of work to do. There's a lot of common sense solutions up here. Let's start basically using best practices to cut, sell the timber, basically, and solve two problems. Okay, thank you. Meeting